Sorry.
Okay, so let's hit. So I'm going to present my very limited experience in medical research and give some guidance and advice, sort of a roadmap for junior doctors and trainees that want to get involved in medical research.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question that we need to ask is why one wants to get involved in medical research. Why junior doctors are interested in research. Is it because you want to discover something new? Is it because you want to improve patients' care? Is it because you want to use research for your academic CV and get better job offers? I mean, one would think that we are all doing it to improve patients' care. And because of that, one would expect that the majority of the research outputs and the research findings to be very good and improve patients' care. But in reality, the majority of published research papers are false. And that was demonstrated very eloquently in one of the landmark papers written in 2005. Actually, this paper has already accumulated nearly 12,000 citations, which is more than double the total number of my citations. So it's a landmark paper in research methodology, indicating and proving in a mathematical way that the majority of research findings that are published are wrong and they're false. And because of that, they don't improve clinical practice. And why is that? Why most of them are false? Well, it's one of the reasons is because every study design has an inherent bias in them. You've learned in your medical school and your statistics that you have type A bias, type B bias, and each study design has its own shortcomings. You get different biases from a randomized control trial, and you get more biases by case series, for example. There is also what we call selective bias, selective reporting. We do a study and we present the results in such a way so that we present something interesting to our audience. And in doing so, we try to move the goalpost to reach to statistically significant results. Otherwise, this may not be interesting for a journal and it may not get published. So we have created a culture of chasing statistical significance. And this links very well to the medical journals publishing papers industry. Obviously, some people want to fulfill their academic ambitions, and that's why they're publishing so much without producing anything of clinical value. And it's also, this might be because of a genuine lack of research training. And last but not least is the fact that not every study can be funded. There's not enough money to go around and support research. Therefore, cost implications are important and related inadvertently or in a negative way with the research produce. And if you want to dig even more in bias threads in medical research, you can have an endless list of problems that you can find in any sort of published study. I mean, there has been a publication in the past that identified 173 potential biases in any given medical paper. I have summarized here some of them that apply in prognostic factor studies, which was my research domain 10 years ago. I can highlight here publication bias that you're all aware of, the lack of power calculations, the lack of protocol registration, the missing data and data manipulation. And when it comes to missing data, there has been a paper 20 years ago now that assessed over 500 studies of prognostic factors in a very rare cancer, neuroblastoma. And the authors found that only 35% of these studies provided results in sufficient detail to allow inclusion of these studies in a meta-analysis. And it just shows that poor quality research does not allow even high quality papers to be conclusive. Is the notion of garbage in, garbage out in a meta-analysis. And similarly, one of my early publications indicated the importance of data availability, selective reporting, and data manipulation in the outcomes of research. So you can see the slide is a bit difficult to interpret, but I can tell you that the dark brown area here is a meta-analysis of a prognostic factor in head and neck cancer that includes only studies that were very easy to identify in PubMed because they were both published and indexed with the prognostic factor in question. And the result in that group of studies was very highly statistically significant. However, if someone was to dig further and identify more studies by looking at the references of the published articles, for example, you could identify more studies and more patients. The results were still statistically significant, but the effect was lower. And if one was able to retrieve additional data from the primary investigators from studies that they haven't been published, then the statistical significance has disappeared altogether. And who knows how many more data exist, but we cannot get our hands in because the authors didn't bother publishing them because the results were not statistically significant. And what I'm trying to say with this slide is that research output and research results are important or are equally important, even if they are negative. So do not trust everything that says is statistically significant. It might be something that is not, and it just hasn't been published. So search for more data if you can. So given all these negative points that I have started my presentation with, is there any hope for you guys in becoming researchers or research astute clinicians in the future? Well, the simple answer is yes, but you need to cultivate a certain ethos and research culture from the very early years of your practice. And you have to have solid medical knowledge, not research-related knowledge, the solid medical knowledge that you get taught in the medical school. And I will come back to that in a second. Obviously, you have to understand study design and the different levels of evidence. And you need to challenge both your consultants, but even yourselves on your day-to-day practice, because if you don't do that, you won't be able to promote change. You need to ensure that you have appropriate mentoring at the early stages of your career in research, and you need to start early. Because if you're an established consultant in a very busy job and you want to start a research career, it's going to be virtually impossible. So what I mean by solid medical knowledge is what you get in the very early years in medical school: the anatomy, physiology, pathology, history taking, clinical examination. It's absolutely crucial to nail this, to know them inside out, because these are the basic sciences that will guide your thought process as a doctor, as a clinician, and as a researcher, because it will allow you to create the most important part of research, which is the research question and the clinical equipoise. And we have to learn some lessons from the recent pandemic, for example. The literature over the last 2 years because of COVID has rocketed, and many authors have published so many papers, but the majority of them haven't really contributed into anything. It's like a pandemic of poor literature alongside with the real pandemic of the virus. And also, we need to have in mind that other factors, non-clinical, like social media or politics or different cultural perspectives, can influence research. And we have seen that in the way the COVID pandemic has come to an end or hasn't come to an end in different countries with different social systems. So what we need to avoid when we do research is, first of all, publish something just for the sake of it. We should not ignore common sense and medical common sense. And that's why the solid medical knowledge that I've mentioned before is crucial. And also what we shouldn't do is accept the culture of the best available evidence. We do this in clinical practice because that's the best evidence we have, that's what we know. We have to challenge that. And if something is not based on the best possible evidence, to try to create it and search for it. What we also need to do is to acknowledge that research in some domains isn't needed. For example, wearing masks when it comes to a respiratory transmitted disease is common sense, is common medical sense. So you shouldn't wait for research results to act upon this or not. I remember at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, March 2020, I was wearing a mask in my hospital. I was told off by a manager suggesting that there's no evidence that masks prevent COVID or not. And I said, my reply was, it's a respiratory virus. I don't need medical evidence for that. Masks protect. And this common sense, this common medical sense, took months until it was implemented in the NHS and in the public politics. So that's why we need to know that in some areas, research is not needed. It's important to acknowledge the limitations of your own work, of your own research work, and the work of others. That's why the most important part in a research paper is the discussion section when you describe the limitations of your study. You need to be able to appraise the medical literature in a critical way and don't accept anything for granted. And it's important to solidify your medical knowledge in your early career years, and always remember that you are doctors above and beyond researchers. So first doctors, then researchers. Otherwise, you just become academics, which is absolutely fine, but it's important to make the discrimination. So let's discuss now about a roadmap as to how you can get involved in research and how you can perform good quality research. The first thing you need to do is to find a mentor, someone who has more experience than you, both in clinical practice and in academic research, and someone who can help you establish yourself. The second thing is to identify a topic that you want to research. This is what we call the research question or the study question. Following that, you need to select the appropriate study design to answer that research question, and then come up with a project plan as to how you're going to do your research. And after you complete your research, you need to look for the research output, how to publish and how to disseminate your results. And then the most difficult part comes, is how to implement the results of your research. Because even if there are very important findings that can change clinical practice, there are several barriers to implement that in the day-to-day clinical practice, especially in the NHS. So how to find a mentor? Well, you need to research to find a mentor, basically. You need to Google or go on the intranet on your local hospital to find someone who has some research background. And how do you do that? You check his publication record. You check in what kind of journals he has published and what impact factor those journals have. But most importantly, check his H index. It's available on Scopus or in Google Scholar. And the H index is important because it shows whether the person you want to be your mentor is currently research active. The higher the index, the more active currently the researcher is. Because there are old professors and researchers that have done research 20 years ago, and they now have stopped. That research products might have been useful 20 years ago, but they're not active anymore, so their H index is very low. So it may not be a good idea approaching these for mentors. You have also need to check whether they have an honorary academic post or an honorary NHS post. And the difference is that academics with an honorary NHS post are not really very active clinicians, whereas the academics with an honorary academic degree are NHS clinicians, day-to-day clinical practice that have some links with university. And be careful about honorary professors, because not all of them are research astute. Some of them have been given the title as a recognition of their excellent clinical practice, and there is nothing wrong with that. But you have to make the discrimination as to why someone is an academic, is an honorary professor in an NHS job. It's important to discriminate. NIH grants for researchers are available on open and public domain, so you can check whether someone who you want to be your mentor has any grants under their name. And you can also check whether there is a formal research role attached to this individual. Your mentor needs to be in an area that is clinically relevant to you and to the research question you want to answer. And it's very important to be approachable and have the right research ethos. So today, for example, for me, it will be a failure if I don't learn something from you guys. I want to learn from my juniors, and I want to be taught by my juniors. I see every person who approaches me for research as an opportunity for me to learn, and as an opportunity to work together and collaborate. So you have to be treated by your mentor as equal colleagues that you have less experience from, but you can contribute in a positive way. And that will be reflected in the authorship list of any publication that comes from this collaboration. So you have to be an author if you participate actively in research. If you just do all the work and you're not part of the publication, then you need to start questioning the contribution of your mentor. Your mentor needs to be passionate in order to generate fruitful arguments with you. Apologies. To generate ideas and shape the ideas. And it's very important to deliver. Some of us are extremely busy, have very busy diaries, and we sort of procrastinate and postpone meetings or have very short meetings or don't give the time that you need to develop yourself as a researcher. So it's important to ask the question, if there is no time, sir, is it okay if you recommend someone else to be my mentor? And then the second step is to identify the topic that you want to research, the research question. That's where you use your sound clinical knowledge, because what you want to research may already have been answered, and you may know the answer to it, or you go to the medical libraries, PubMed and the other databases, and find the answer. And use your common sense, the example of masks and COVID that I've mentioned earlier, because not all questions need a randomized controlled trial to be answered. And look if the topic you want to research has clinical equipoise. If there isn't clinical equipoise and the answer is still not available, how you can generate that clinical equipoise to justify the need for research. And after you answer all these questions, you will come to the conclusion as to whether your topic can become a proper research idea. Is it practical? Is your idea, for example, related to very rare syndromic patients that you will never generate enough power in any study to answer any question? Or is the size required for a proposed trial too big that will make funding impossible? For example, if you want to, I don't know, prove the negative effect of drinking Coca-Cola amongst the population to relate to cardiovascular events. It might be an effect, but it's going to be so minute that you will need millions in a randomized controlled trial to prove it. So is it worth the funding for that, for example? You all know the study design and the evidence pyramid. At the very bottom, expert opinion. So like myself, ignore it completely. It's of no value in most times. Case series and case reports, yeah, enough to generate some sort of research question and some equipoise. Case control trials, case control studies higher up. Cohort studies, very important, especially in preparation for a randomized control trial, such as the trial that we are currently applying for funding in multiple fractures. The equipoise was generated by a cohort trial, and that's why we went on to apply for funding for a randomized control trial. And at the very top, systematic reviews and meta-analysis, but only if they generate the answer. Because if the only thing that the systematic review does is to say that the quality of the evidence is not enough to answer the question, then you need to go back to the randomized control trial and try to answer it. So let's have an imaginary RCT that you as a junior researcher, you want to get funding from NIHR. The first thing you want to do is to decide which program of the NIHR you want to apply for. And there are so many different programs. You have health technology assessment when you compare, for example, two pharmacological interventions to see which works best for a particular illness. You have research for patient benefit, which is sort of a combination of the intervention to enhance the patient's quality of life, for example. You have programs linked with public health. You have programs linked to systematic reviews and evidence synthesis. So you choose which one applies to your study question. And then you need to assemble a team. The team is usually made up by a lead applicant, who is going to be the chief investigator, and a joint lead applicant, who is going to be the co-chief investigator for a trial. And then you need plenty of co-applicants. You need clinical trials you need to support to run the day-to-day tasks for a trial. You need a trial manager, a statistician, a health economist, a patient and public involvement lead. That's very, very crucial. And you need patients and PPI representatives. Patients' involvement is often underestimated in medical research, but you cannot imagine how crucial their views are. After all, the research is done for patients' benefit, to improve the care that we provide to our patients. So we need to know what matters to them, because what matters to us might be completely irrelevant to patients. We may, for example, try a new chemotherapy drug in terminal cancer patients that improves survival by 3 or 4 months, but it leads to them being in hospital for 2 additional months from their overall survival. And they may come back to us and say, I don't want that. I don't want this trial because it's important for me to have quality of life and live less, for example. So patients' views are crucial and they need to be included in every funding application for a trial. So this is a summary of how you go along applying for a grant for an imaginary randomized controlled trial. Research question, choose which program you'll go for, involve patients and public very high in your checklist, get some methodology advice, because even if you're very research astute, you're not a trialist, you're not an academic. So each local network has what we call RDS, Research Design Service, which are basically people that offer free advice for potential researchers. And then you need to develop the research team, as I've discussed before. Consider whether your research will generate intellectual property. That's very important, and I will come back to towards the end of my talk, because publications or research outputs can be linked with intellectual rights, and you may be in trouble from a medical legal point of view if you don't consider that. Regulatory approval is what we call ethics in research. Nowadays, it's quite easy to go through a national link. It's called the IRAS for every application, and you can get approval for a multi-center trial only through one application. And then you need to plan what kind of impact your research have, how you're going to change practice with your research findings. And then you need to draft your application and present it in a very clear way. So it's a lot of work to be done just to go through stage 1 NIHR funding application. So it is difficult, and there is a very detailed guidance in the NIHR website. I mean, it might take you 2 or 3 days just to read the guidance, but I would recommend you do that because you get an understanding as to how you can plan your research. At the same time, you can get your good clinical practice course and accreditation through the free platform of NIHR. It's good to work in a step-by-step fashion, and always know that people who are not doctors and they work in clinical trials unit, the methodologists, are very keen to help you because of their lack of medical knowledge. They feel that they learn from you, and it's a mutual understanding and collaboration. So they're very open and very approachable. And this is something very important for you guys. It's actually the key of my lecture today, so please pay attention to that. It's the new concept of the associate PI scheme that the NIHR has launched not so long ago. As I've mentioned, each randomized controlled trial is run by 1 or 2 chief investigators and several principal investigators in the local sites. And the principal investigators are usually established consultants who have some sort of clinical research experience. Now, NIHR supports training and involvement of junior doctors like you in clinical research. And it's not just junior doctors, it's all healthcare professionals that they don't have research experience and they want to get research experience. And they can do that via the associate PI scheme. So basically, it's a 6-month in-work training opportunity to get practical experience for people who want to get involved in a research career in the future. It's like a driving teaching test. So you learn on the go. You have someone on you are the learner driver with the teacher on the seat next to you, that he can hit the brake if you are about to crash and give you advice as you go along. It's supported and endorsed by all Royal Colleges, and it's very important to note that it's certified and accredited. So if you participate in the associate PI scheme for 6 months, you will get formal accreditation. You can use that in your CV, and you can use it in any future application that you want to become a principal investigator or a chief investigator, that you have actually been involved in research in a training fashion in a safe environment. So how can you get involved? Well, you can find a trial in your local hospital, or you can find a trial via the NIHR website that is registered with the associate PI scheme. Easy to do. Preferentially, this trial must be in the setup phase, but this is not mandatory. And it's important to be in the setup phase because you can see the difficulties that chief investigators and principal investigators are going through in order to set up the trial before it starts. After you do that, you speak to the local PI for the trial, who will link you with the clinical trials unit, and then you will start participating in the trial, and your participation will actually be included in the costings and the budget of the trial. So that if someone applies for NIHR grant and says, I'm going to include associate PIs in the trial, junior doctors, for example, I'm going to cost them so that your work that is done is paid through the trial. It leads to certification, as I've mentioned, and it helps you to learn and start your research career in a very safe environment. So, a summary of how to get involved: have a look at NIHR or your local hospital and find which trials are registered. Speak to the PI, contact the PI in the hospital, contact the clinical trials unit and the R&D department, and you complete an application through an online form that will link you to the NIHR website, and that's it. You are an associate PI. It's a 6-month commitment. You need to participate in the monthly research team meetings. Sometimes it's not monthly, it's every 2 months or every 3 months. You have to maintain a portfolio like you do for your training. And you have to deputize for the PI sometimes if it's not available, but that will come later towards your placement once you learn how to do it. And you have access to online learning platforms through the NIHR website that it teaches you your duties as a PI and what you need to do and how you need to get involved. So the associate PI scheme is something that you need to genuinely get involved if you want to become clinical researchers in the future. And you can do it tomorrow. Go to your hospital, see if there is a study that is registered with the associate PI scheme. Ask your PIs, can I get involved? They will help you. It is much easier, though, to start your research career by doing a systematic review. And you all know the steps of doing a systematic review. You have to register it with Prospero. You have to draft a meta-analysis or a systematic review protocol. You have to identify the relevant studies and perform data extraction. If it's possible, to do a data analysis and synthesis in the form of meta-analysis. But very important to do quality assessment of the studies that you have included in your systematic review. Possibly the most important part of doing a systematic review, to do quality assessment, because you will realize that in most of the times, quality of the studies that you include is very poor. Then you have to draft a narrative as to what the systematic review has shown, and report your meta-analysis in a Prisma fashion based on the guidelines, and submit it for publication, emphasizing on the limitations of the systematic review. Over the last 4 years, out of 10 systematic reviews I've published, there's only one that arrived into solid conclusions that this intervention that I've looked at works. 9 out of 10 show that there is not enough evidence, quality is poor, we need to run again. And that's an important finding, but don't get me wrong, it shows that previous studies haven't really answered the question because they haven't been designed properly. Dissemination of research output. This is usually links to a scientific publication in a peer-reviewed journal. So you need to choose which journal. You need to choose a journal that the specialty of the research that you've done is relevant. You need to choose a journal with a high impact factor, and it has a quick review turnaround time. At least that's how I go when I choose a journal to publish. When you write an article, you need to be very concise. Editors and peer reviewers hate when someone rambles around without getting to the point of the publication and what the research is about. It's important to be very cautious with plagiarism because there are very good tools available for journal editors to check on that, and you might be in trouble if you copy and paste from other previous publications. As I've mentioned earlier, and I will mention again, the limitations paragraph and the limitations section in your discussion should be the biggest section because it's the most important, because you need to be open and honest and transparent as to what problems your research has so that future researchers can work on them and address them. You have to reference your statements appropriately, and you have to be very honest as to who is your authors and co-authors, and who's going to be the first author and the last author and the senior author. And you should not succumb to pressures or peer pressures to add people as authors in a paper if they haven't contributed enough to be named as authors. Each journal has guidelines, which you need to read very carefully before you draft your paper and submit for publication. And you need to publish everything. If you have done research in a correct fashion, if you run a trial in the appropriate way, even if the results are negative and not statistically significant, are equally important for the research and the medical community. So you need to publish them. Now, social media has changed the way healthcare is managed and research is disseminated. You've got Twitter, you've got Instagram, you've got LinkedIn, you've got every platform that is available for dissemination of research outputs. So that's a good thing, that's a positive, because colleagues can find out quickly about a new interesting finding. Patients can access them, so they are not completely in the dark when they come to see you in clinic. But at the same time, as I've mentioned earlier, it's important to be careful about intellectual property and copyright, because some of the journals have very strict copyright rules. And if your paper appears on Twitter before the journal allows it, you may be in trouble for intellectual copyright breach. The last point is research implementation and findings implementation. Are your findings practice changing or potentially practice changing? If yes, how can you disseminate them and how can you implement them amongst your colleagues? Are your findings just enough to generate equipoise? That's good enough, but it's a step towards further research rather than changing practice? Are your findings good enough to tickle NICE to endorse them? And if it does, then that will be a step towards implementing them in NHS clinical practice. They might be included in national or international guidelines, and that's a very helpful step towards your colleagues endorsing them. Do you have the support of your national or international associations, either during or after you have completed your research trial? And have you used media wisely to inform your colleagues about the change in practice that is required? Because it's impossible or near impossible to change practice that is very deeply established in clinicians' minds. It's unfortunately linked with the culture in the NHS. If you try to change something, even if there is undisputable evidence that this is a good thing to do, it can be very difficult to move people around to change their minds. And one of the most important things is that you need to prove that it's cost effective. In our societies, unfortunately, everything is linked with money and cost. So cost effectiveness is crucial, and it's an inherent part of every randomized controlled trial. You need to prove that your intervention is cost effective. Otherwise, it may be very difficult to establish. And you need to convince, like I said earlier, your colleagues and patients that this is an acceptable intervention and we need to change the practice. So, in summary, if someone wants to be involved in medical research, it's a very, very difficult journey. It's a day-to-day learning throughout. It never stops. It has to start early, and it will only stop when you retire from clinical practice. If you are a clinician, a day-to-day clinician like myself, with 2 surgical lists every week and 2 days full of clinics, that makes academic research very hard. On the other hand, if you are a full-time academic and you work in a university, that makes clinical engagement harder. So it's important to get the balance right in the two. It takes lots of effort, sweat, and tears. But in the end, if you deliver something meaningful and you change practice for the patient's benefit, it can be very rewarding. So your approach must be patient-centered throughout, always, from the start to the end. So there's no limits. If you want to try, and you can go and you can reach the sky. So that's what I wanted to present today. I hope it wasn't very boring. I hope it was useful, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I hope my presentation has generated more questions than it had answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kyzas. I have a question, actually.
Okay.
Is it okay? For example, on clinical practice, if a student approaches you searching for a research project, what do you particularly look at in the student to give him a research project?
Well, to be honest, I'm going to have a chat to see whether the student understands the clinical background of the research project that wants to be involved, if he comes to me with an idea. If he has no idea and just wants to get involved in research, then I will have a general discussion as to how much he understands about research and research methodology. And if there is no understanding whatsoever, I'm not going to turn my colleague down. I'm going to advise to go and study the basics of research design and trials design and methodology design. And then when it comes back, I will offer the opportunity of participating as an associate PI in a trial that I run, for example, or I can guide through a systematic review on a topic that we can choose together. Or if the experience is completely limited and non-existent, we may start with a case report that will allow searching of clinical notes and history to solidify the basic medical knowledge that is a prerequisite in all medical research. That's why I've emphasized at the very beginning the importance of solid medical knowledge and background. This is the most important tool that you need to have. Otherwise, even if you do research, you are not going to do it in the right way.
That makes a lot of sense. Does anyone else have questions? I'll open chat box too.
Mohammed.
Hello, thank you for the talk. Just on one of the points that you made there, so to the student who you turn away saying, okay, you need to do more study on research methodology, etc. Are there any particular things you recommend that student to go away and read?
So I've got a Dropbox link that I will share with the student when he approaches me. So, I mean, every medical student goes through statistics and epidemiology in your medical degree, isn't it? This is a fundamental class that most of us, I mean, myself included in medical school, we just ignored or just sailed through because it wasn't very interesting. And then when I started engaging with research, I've realized that it was a very useful class. So I went back and read everything related to that class, even if I didn't have to. So that would be my first advice: epidemiology and statistics. And you will learn a lot about study design from that class. And then there are landmark papers about that. And there are books that you can read. And I've got a selection of those and I can share with everyone that wants.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anyone else has a question? Or any comments to say? No? I think no one is saying anything. Do you have any final thoughts, Mr. Kyzas, to share?
Well, that means that everyone has understood everything, or nobody has understood anything, which I hope that's not the case. I hope I've managed to share a few of my thoughts as to what you need to do to get involved in clinical research. Just go and speak to your consultant colleagues tomorrow, find a mentor, get into the associate PI scheme, and continue to study about research, and it will be rewarding. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for your talk, and thank you for the associate PI program mentioning. I never heard of it before. Actually.
So there is a lot of information on the NIHR website, way more than I have presented today. It's freely accessible. Go there, have a look. It's so easy to implement, and the investigators like myself want trainees to get involved because they are sometimes way more reliable and hardworking than established consultants, purely because of workload. So it's something that we promote, and we want. Try it.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And all of you have a lovely weekend, and thank you for the opportunity.
And you too have a good on-call weekend. I hope it's
Thank you very much.
If you're right.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.